Joining us on Ballot Boxing this weekend is Dr. Steve Turley, something that we're hearing a lot about right now, especially with the election, and the two vastly different choices are modern secularism or more conservative, say, Judeo-Christian values. Dr. Turley has written a piece called Will the Modernists Inherit the Earth? The Dismal Prospects for Secular Liberalism. Dr. Turley, it's great to have you.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be with you.
Well, your headline certainly caught my attention, which I think is the goal of anybody who's writing a piece, is to catch the eyes of the viewer. Right now, with a lot of the things that are being debated and talked about at the Democratic Convention, and President Trump is mentioning in his campaign, wouldn't necessarily point, in my view at least, to dismal prospects for secular liberalism. We're always seeing that there are school districts, local governments, bills in Congress, other areas where secular liberalism seems to be the wave of the future. But dismal prospects, can you expound on that?
Yeah, that's a really nice way of framing it, because I would agree with you 100%. Everywhere, I actually start my article with that. Everywhere you look, from a conservative traditionalist vantage point, it almost seems like just build your bunker and just see your way through this, because all is lost. Secular modernity is taking over, and there's really nothing you can do. Actually, even in sociology departments for much of the 20th century, they operated with the normativity of something called the secularization thesis, which was that the more educated a society became, the more technological it became, then the more secular it become and less religious. And what I basically argue in the article is, what if that were only half the story? What if all of these secularization processes that we see happening in front of us, they were actually part of a dialectic that's actually creating a bit of a backlash against this secularization? And the data is in, and more scholars are actually arguing that we're entering into a post-secular age. Now, I came across this scholarship probably about 12 years ago or so, and I didn't believe it. I poo-pooed it. I said, oh, yeah, right. I don't know what you guys are smoking. But I have to say that over that 12-year period, I've seen that what they have been observing, which is that actually religion is growing by leaps and bounds all over the world. As a matter of fact, Rodney Stark, the sociologist at Baylor University, argues we're currently in the midst of the single greatest religious renewal the world has ever seen. Those statistics have borne themselves out. And so what I focus on the article on are primarily two, a major one and a minor one. And that's the development of a very discrepant demographic movement, where you're seeing conservative religionists, and in the West, particularly Christians, Mormons, and Islamists, having children with a very large fertility edge over secularists who have simply more or less stopped having children. And what demographers the old saying, demography is destiny, what they're looking at is, wait a minute now, over time, this fertility deficit is going to have extraordinary political ramifications. And we're actually already seeing those political ramifications. Trump won in states that have, on average, a 12% fertility advantage over and against the blue states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So I'm looking at that. I'm saying, well, wait a minute now. If we're seeing secularists begin to lose any genetic legacy, whereas conservative Christians and religious in general are having this massive genetic legacy, then over 20, 40, 60 years, we're going to have a very different demographic complexion in the United States. And then the second one I look at is the political discontent that we're seeing, obviously, in the rise of nationalist populism going on throughout the West, but indeed the world as well, in India, Russia. And so I make an argument that these two, combined with just the overall vision of post-secularism coming out of the academy right now in many of these studies, does not bode very well for secular liberalism in the future.
Talking with Dr. Steve Turley, who's written a very interesting piece called Will the Modernists Inherit the Earth? the dismal prospects for secular liberalism. So, Dr. Turley, one of the things that right-leaning, conservative Christian folks tend to complain about is that the left has infiltrated the education system and that young people are indoctrinated with left-leaning Marxism, socialism, all of these other negative values. Is there an estimate as to how many of these children who are being born to these more fertile families will stick with the principles that their parents have ingrained in them, or some may walk away? I mean, you see a lot of reality TV shows where you have these traditional value, right of center Christian folks whose kids are rejecting openly a lot of the principles that their parents have tried to teach them. Do you have any idea how many of these kids will stay with that or will walk away, and what difference that makes in perhaps equaling out the secular children who grow up and the children who are more religious?
That's an excellent question, Aaron, and a vital one, because if you're right, if like the Breaking Amish programs are the norm, then yeah, we're just beating hot air at this point. I mean, forget whatever demographic advantage conservative religionists have. It'll be negated the moment kids go to school or go to college. Excellent question. Yeah, we do have the data on that as well. Eric Kaufman, whose work, he has a metadata study called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? He's a professor at the University of London. He's compiled statistics that show that the more conservative the religious commitment, the more it tends to translate into the next generation. So we're talking upwards of 70 to 80% retention rates of young people as they grow up into their adulthood, retaining their parents and oftentimes their grandparents' faith commitment. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the primary reasons is that they rely a lot on parallel structures, so homeschooling, Bible colleges, and the like. Again, conservative Christian communities tend to be very tight-knit, very intentional with their community. Their kids tend to marry endogamously. They marry inside the faith and so on. We also have some interesting statistics as well. I think these come from the General Social Survey, and they show that liberals, secular liberals, are actually far more likely to become conservative than the other way around, which I was actually very surprised with. It's a 21% to 15% comparison, where 21% of liberals are more become conservative, and only 15% of conservatives become liberals. So there's a 6-point gap there. And that fellow I mentioned, Rodney Stark, he points to a study both at his Baylor University and University of Texas that show that young, particularly evangelicals, are not just every bit as conservative as their elders, they're actually even more conservative in certain areas. And we're finding that to be true with Generation Zers in general. Generation Zers today are the single most conservative generation. These are generally, if I recall, it's like 22 and younger. Generation Zers are the single most conservative generation we've actually ever recorded, we've ever seen. A YouGov study came out, and YouGov is pretty impressive because YouGov maintains what's arguably the largest panel of survey respondents in the Western world. So its data set contains the views of about 200,000 people, almost 250,000. And so that means for every single age, apart from the very old, they're not including the 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds, but apart from, every single age, the representative sample is about 30,000 to 4,500 people. It's a huge sample. And the latest one that came out of Britain found, if you can believe, again, it blew my mind, and I'm tracking with this stuff. It found that 18-year-olds are as likely to be right-wing in Britain right now as we speak as 40-year-olds. Fascinating study. So yes, I think there's a lot to be concerned about in terms of the education system and the like. I think we would all agree. I tend to be a big proponent of the classical education renewal that's going on. It's bringing back Latin and Greek and the great books and critical thinking and the like. We could certainly do that, but what is happening is that this conservative, religionist demographic advantage is maintaining itself clearly into adulthood.
So establishing that, how does all of this translate into public policy and governance? Are these younger people that are obviously holding near and dear to them these conservative Christian ideals and mom and dad passed down. Are they evangelistic about them? Are they wanting to spread them, or are they more wanting to live them for them and their families?
It's a great question. I think that it depends on the community. It depends on the religious tradition. What we're seeing is that these are happening primarily, obviously, in red states that already have an advantage over blue states. Blue states, so we're talking, the Pacific Northwest, Northeast, where I grew up, in the greater New York City area. Those are going to be very secular. So those are going to be very small communities that don't have a lot of political impact or like. I think what you are seeing is you're beginning to see the recognition that the separationist model between church and state is beginning to wane. It did not really surface until 1940. There was an interesting statistic I came across, and I'm sticking my neck out because I'll have to find, I don't have the reference right in front of me. But prior to 1940, the term separation between church and state from Thomas Jefferson's letter to the American Baptist Association, that was only used, a dozen times or so in Supreme Court decisions. Since 1940, it has been used, tens of thousands of times. So there was this radical discrepant shift for whatever reason around 1940. I think it's largely because of the advent of what's called positivist law as against natural law in our law schools. So with that, we had a very, very strong separationist tendency that pushed the church into the private sphere of life. It moved the church from the town green next to the dry cleaners and the pizzerias and the like, which is very, very devastating for faith, because faith does claim to provide a civilizational, objective vision of life that cannot make that claim plausibly if it's been reconsigned to the area of consumerism. And so what I think you're seeing with the Supreme Court decisions over the last 10 years is a bit of a mea culpa on that, particularly the Trinity Lutheran decision that happened a couple of years ago, where they are saying, no, church and state can actually work together. It's known as the accommodationist view. It's really the view of our founding fathers. They can work together, but both in their own unique spheres. The church is not the state's not the church. And both have to recognize genuine human freedom. You don't have true faith without freedom. Freedom is necessary for it. It cannot be compulsed. It cannot be compelled or the like. But you can't have true freedom without virtue, as we're finding in our cities today, our urban areas today, that are just morally imploding everywhere we look. But you can't have virtue without faith. But you can't have faith without freedom, and that's the so-called golden triangle of our founding fathers. Pretty brilliant stuff. So at least it's my hope that I think we're going to see more of a return to that, which I think spells very good news for the future.
Talking with Dr. Steve Turley, he's written a fascinating piece called "Will the Modernists Inherit the Earth? The Dismal Prospects for Secular Liberalism." We'll link to this piece at kmjnow.com. Dr. Turley, wish we had more time. This is a fascinating subject that I could probably go on 2 or 3 more segments, but we'll have to end it at this. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. It's my pleasure.